In the summer of 1943, a German soldier, now a prisoner of war, sat in the sweltering heat of a Tennessee camp. His gaze was locked on a small rectangle wrapped in plain brown paper. Under the southern sun, its edges began to soften, and a faint sheen appeared where chocolate was starting to melt. He hadn't known a taste this sweet since 1939, a time when the war was just a whisper and Germany's cities still wore a mask of prosperity. Now, deep in enemy territory, a land he was told was decadent and starving, a feast was being offered to him in the simple form of a ration. He unwrapped the bar with deliberate slowness, as if the slightest wrong move might make it disappear. When the first square met his tongue, his entire world tilted on its axis. This was not the welcome they had been promised. They were supposed to face chains, starvation, and humiliation. Their generals had sworn that surrendering to the Americans meant a life of misery. Propaganda had painted the United States as a nation of mongrels, too soft to wage a real war, too poor to even feed itself, let alone its prisoners. But here, after crossing thousands of miles of ocean, after months of brutal combat in North Africa, they found a reality that shattered every lie they had been fed. Instead of stale bread crusts, they were given soft white bread. Instead of the bitter brew they called coffee, they were served the real, fragrant thing. The watery cabbage soup of the front lines was replaced by canned meat, processed cheese, chewing gum, and chocolate. For the men of Rommel's Africa Corps, capture had been a sudden end to 2 years of desert warfare defined by dust storms and gnawing hunger. Their surrender in Tunisia had been swift. Nearly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken in that final campaign. Thousands of them were shipped across the Atlantic under armed guard and deposited in hastily constructed camps across the American South and Midwest. The journey itself felt unreal. They had boarded the ships as enemies of democracy, but they stepped onto American soil as prisoners who could hear the laughter of children from beyond the barbed wire. They could see farmers working vast, endless fields and smell evening meals drifting from nearby towns. While war consumed Europe, life in the United States appeared shockingly normal, abundant, and untouched. The first true shock came in the mess halls. The German soldiers stood in line, bracing for ridicule and cruelty. Instead, guards handed them trays laden with food many had not seen in years: fresh vegetables, white potatoes, thick slabs of meat, and real butter. Some meals even came with dessert, ice cream in the summer or cake on special occasions. And inside each ration kit were unexpected treasures: cigarettes, chocolate, gum, and candy bars. To the American Army, these were simply essentials for morale, small comforts for men at war. But for the German prisoners, they were luxuries that defied belief. To grasp the depth of this shock, you must understand what rations meant in wartime Europe. By 1943, German civilians survived on thin slices of bread, ersatz, spreads made from ground beets, and watery soups. Coffee was a substitute brewed from roasted acorns. Meat was a rarity, butter was even scarcer, and chocolate was a myth. Even soldiers on the front lines carried little more than dry biscuits and thin sausage. Hunger was a constant companion for everyone. Food was simply survival, stripped of all pleasure. And then there was America. The K ration, the standard field kit for every U.S. soldier, was a world apart. It held biscuits, canned cheese, powdered lemonade, a tin of processed meat, a fruit bar, and, without fail, a small block of chocolate, chewing gum, and a pack of cigarettes. To the Americans, this was the bare minimum. Soldiers complained about the spam, laughed at the powdered drinks, and cursed the monotonous meals. But for the Germans receiving the same kits behind barbed wire, each package was an astonishment. It was proof of a society so wealthy it could afford to feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. At first, the prisoners treated these gifts with deep suspicion. Surely, it was a trick to soften them up for interrogation. But the generosity continued day after day. The cigarettes were real. The chocolate was impossibly sweet and smooth. The gum snapped with a mint flavor that felt alien. One soldier, unwrapping a Hershey bar, whispered in awe, "This tastes like another world." Another would later recall, "The first cigarette I smoked in that camp meant more than any speech. It told me this country had riches we couldn't even imagine." Joseph Goebbels' propaganda had relied on fear. It painted the Allies as brutes and America as a land of chaos and poverty. But here in Tennessee, in Texas, in Nebraska, the truth stood in stark contrast. Prisoners received 3 meals a day, often with more calories than they'd had in months. Cigarettes were issued freely, their smoke rising like visible proof of American plenty. They were given chocolate bars that children back in Germany could only dream of. The American guards treated these items as commonplace. A candy bar cost 5 cents at the canteen. Cigarettes were available in endless packs. To the Americans, they were trifles. To the Germans, they were treasures. The effect was profoundly disorienting. These men had gone to war convinced of German superiority, taught that the Third Reich was the height of modern power. Yet here they were, imprisoned in a country where even enemies were fed with an abundance that served as a quiet weapon, undermining every lie they had ever been told. If the Americans were so weak, how could they afford such generosity? If they were so decadent, how did they fight with such force? The bitterness of defeat was made sharper by this contrast. In Germany, families were starving. In America, prisoners ate chocolate. One prisoner later wrote, "It wasn't the barbed wire that held us captive. It was the sight of all this plenty. We understood that our leaders had lied, and that realization was a harder pill to swallow than defeat itself. For them, defeat meant putting down their weapons. The chocolate meant questioning everything. The American guards themselves were often oblivious to the impact of these small acts. To them, a cigarette was just a smoke break, and chocolate was a minor pleasure between shifts. They complained about the spam, made jokes about the Army-issue coffee, and sometimes tossed candy bars to children playing near the camp fences. They couldn't grasp how each of these casual gestures struck the German prisoners like a hammer blow to their pride. For men who had been raised in a world of scarcity, this effortless generosity spoke of unimaginable resources. Inside the camps, the rations became more than just food. They transformed into symbols, tokens of a much larger truth. The chocolate was hoarded and savored, sometimes sent home in letters as unbelievable proof of this strange American reality. When packages with candy or gum arrived in Germany, families often refused to believe their eyes. Surely, this had to be some kind of reverse propaganda. America couldn't possibly waste such riches on its prisoners. And yet, the truth was there, wrapped in simple foil and brown paper. As the days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to talk amongst themselves. What did it mean that their captors shared luxuries even with their enemies? What did it say about a society that considered a chocolate bar not an indulgence, but a necessity? Slowly, a new understanding began to take root. They were witnessing the power of an economy and a culture so fundamentally different from their own, it felt as though it were from another planet. In that realization, the seeds of a profound change were planted, seeds that would continue to grow long after the war, shaping how these men would come to view democracy, prosperity, and freedom. The first taste of chocolate was enough to confuse the prisoners, but it was the steady curl of cigarette smoke that truly began to haunt them. In Europe, a cigarette was not just tobacco wrapped in paper. It was a form of wealth. It was power. It offered a moment of relief from the gnawing pains of hunger and stress. It was the kind of thing a man might trade his boots for, or even risk his life to obtain. In 1943, a single cigarette in Germany could secure your survival in a prison cell or buy you a moment of warmth. It was the most coveted currency in a society on the verge of collapse. And yet here, in American prison camps, cigarettes were handed out in bulk, as casually as bread. Each ration kit contained a small pack of Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields. To the American soldiers, they were an expected part of the kit. To the German prisoners, they were astonishing, more valuable than money. They were symbols of a nation so wealthy it could afford to give luxuries to its enemies without a second thought. One prisoner later called it the arithmetic of abundance. In the camps, this new math could be measured in cigarettes. A skilled tailor might mend a coat for 5. A talented cook could improve the bland camp rations for 2. Within days, cigarettes had become the dominant currency. The American Guard seemed almost blind to this. They handed out cartons and flicked cigarettes from their own packs without much thought. To them, it was nothing. To the prisoners, it was a revelation. Candy and gum played their own part in this strange education. Many of the men hadn't seen such things since they were children. The chewing gum, with its artificial fruit and mint flavors, felt like a kind of magic. One prisoner recalled chewing a single stick for hours, unable to spit it out, as if doing so would make the taste of America disappear forever. They began to study the packaging like archaeologists discovering a lost civilization. The bright, playful logos on a Hershey's wrapper spoke of a society that valued pleasure as much as survival. The numbers told an even starker story. A typical American K ration contained around 3,000 calories. It included cheese, meat, biscuits, chocolate, and more. By contrast, a German soldier's ration on the front lines was about 1,200 calories, often less. Even as prisoners, the Germans were consuming more calories and a greater variety of food than their comrades still fighting in Europe. And this abundance was routine. The American supply lines seemed endless. The prisoners did the math in their heads and understood. This was not a society on the verge of collapse. This was a giant. By 1945, the ships that had carried them to America as prisoners now returned them as survivors. Their uniforms were faded, and their hands were empty of weapons. Instead, they carried carved trinkets from camp workshops, a few photographs, and the carefully folded wrappers of candy bars and cigarettes, relics of another world. They were not just sailing back to a defeated Germany. They were sailing into a storm of disillusionment. The homeland they returned to was a ghost. Cities lay in skeletal ruins, and the air, once thick with the smell of coal and baking bread, now tasted of ash and decay. The faces of the people they passed were etched with hunger. In that first shocking moment on German soil, the prisoners understood a terrible truth. The Third Reich, which had promised 1,000 years of glory, had delivered only ruin in less than 20. But in their pockets, they carried the memory of something different. The flattened wrappers from Hershey bars and the empty packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes felt like forbidden souvenirs of freedom. To their families, these small tokens were either miracles or cruel jokes. A mother might weep at the sight of a candy wrapper, not for its lost sweetness, but for the world it represented, a world where enemies ate better than her own children. Fathers would hold the empty cigarette packs as if they were alien artifacts. "Impossible," they would whisper. "This must be propaganda." But the men who had been there knew it was real. They had lived it. This truth created a sharp private conflict within each returning soldier. How could they speak of America's abundance while their own neighbors starved? Some chose silence, ashamed of an experience that felt like a betrayal. Others spoke cautiously, framing their stories as strange oddities of war. But a few told the blunt truth: they had tasted a different way of life, and it was sweet. That sweetness lingered in their minds more vividly than the heat of the desert or the sound of gunfire. A man would remember the simple act of lighting a cigarette, knowing there were countless more, and feel the phantom weight of wealth in his lungs. For men taught that obedience and fear were the highest virtues, this encounter with casual kindness and careless plenty was transformative. The ashes of the empire were everywhere. The Führer had promised victory and left only rubble. But across the ocean, these men had seen a different model of strength, one forged not in terror, but in abundance. They had seen guards toss away half-smoked cigarettes and children eating candy as if it were nothing. That contrast burned in their minds, a silent indictment of everything they had once been forced to believe. Some carried that memory into politics and classrooms, becoming quiet advocates for a new Germany, one built not on hollow promises, but on the dignity of ordinary life. The final transformation was not a single event, but a slow dawning realization. The empire was gone. In its place was the possibility of something new, a future shaped not by fear, but by the memory of chocolate and cigarettes. The men who had been enemies had become witnesses, witnesses to a society that revealed its strength not through cruelty, but through its casual generosity. They carried that knowledge back into the ruins, where it became part of the soil from which a new Germany would eventually grow. Their defeat had been written not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet power of a candy bar melting in a prisoner's hand. That was the most haunting truth of all. The bitter ashes of their empire had been swept away by the undeniable sweetness of freedom.